So a warm welcome to everybody, and thank you for joining us at Porsche Conversations. I'm really honored and delighted to introduce our speaker for today, Khyati Saraf. Khyati is a landscape architect currently based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. She was born and raised in Delhi and is particularly attuned to the role of social spatial drivers and geopolitics that produce public space and hinterland landscapes. Her recent research work investigates the relationships between Fisher Fork and Megaport at Kandla, Gujarat, teasing out the regulatory frameworks and spatial disposition by which communities are disenfranchised through an explicit reframing of the landscape. In March 2019, this work was exhibited at Khoj, New Delhi. Her work as a professional landscape architect spans a wide range of scales, geographies, from small residential gardens, institutional and campus plots to large infrastructural landscapes. She currently practices at Michael van Valkenburg Associates. She's a member of the design collective Landkunst and co-founder of Bilkul. In 2019, she was a Design Earth Fellow, and in 2017, a Metro Manila Civic Innovation Fellow, traveling to Manila to work with the local city government to bring issues of flooding, ecology, and civic engagement to the fore. In 2016, she was recognized as a young leader in design in landscape architecture in the US. Khyati earned her Master's of Landscape Architecture at Harvard University Graduate School of Design and a Bachelor's of Architecture at the Sushant School of Art and Architecture, New Delhi. It gives me great joy in welcoming Khyati. Please, thank you so much for this.
Yeah, hello everyone. Thank you, Sarosh, for that introduction, and thank you for the invitation to be here today. Really honored and excited to be here and to share a little bit with you about Delhi. I was excited to hear that Porsche was engaging with sort of the Central Vista project and Delhi. And as Sarosh mentioned, I'm a landscape architect, so I'm hoping I can throw some light on Delhi with a twist of landscape. So growing up in Delhi, I learned early the delights of landscape and public space, the pleasure of gardens and parks, but also the delight of a single tree on a dusty road under which I waited for my school bus. Crisp December afternoons were meant for family picnics in Nehru Park. Cool summer evenings meant an almost ritualistic visit to the India Gate lawns to enjoy balloons, bubbles, and ice cream. Hundreds of families, friends, lovers enjoying a moment of respite under the trees on the lawns that flanked Rajpath. The view up to Raisena Hill and to India Gate and the enormity of its architecture was overwhelmingly present, foregrounded by the brightly lit ice cream telas on Rajpath. Even as a child, the topography of the landscape, the situating of Rashtrapati Bhavan on a hill with a steep slope up to it always fascinated me. There was something about that topography, the view from downhill, looking up to President's House, something about that experience that sort of remained with me. But this situating of the current day Rashtrapati Bhavan and then in the British colonial times, the Viceroy's House, as it was meant to be, Rajpath and India Gate. So for this conversation, the site essentially for New Delhi, was selected over 100 years ago for the imperial throne and was not always the first choice. And that's what I really want to dive into and talk about. In 1912, the Delhi Town Planning Committee, comprising of Lutyens Baker, George Swinton, Lord Hardinge, to name a few members, was established to find a suitable site for the imperial city. Initially, several sites were considered, and the Town Planning Committee spent 5 weeks exploring Delhi, occasionally by car, and as it appears here, on elephant back sometimes, to find the appropriate, and I quote, site. These investigations included the site of the Darbar, north of Shahjahanabad, a site across the river from the old city, and one west of the ridge, none of which were eventually deemed suitable, though the decision was though the decision was influenced by the politics and the polity of the time, the story of why present-day Rajpath came to be where it is reveals more about the landscape and the non-human entities and geomorphologies that impacted this decision than the town planning committee would like to admit. The story is fascinating. The site of the Darbar was considered symbolically tainted. It was the site of 3 coronations of British monarchs and a reminder to the Indian public of the brutal suppression on the Northern Ridge during the revolt of 1857. The existing British enclave at Civil Lines was already extensively constructed and haphazardly settled at the time as well. Moreover, the relationship and narrowing of the plain between the ridge and the river meant potential flooding on the Yamuna floodplain, and the resultant high water table was a serious concern. You can see the ridge and then the Yamuna. Though this site was a popular choice, it was eventually abandoned. The site across the river was too physically separated by the river itself. Since most of the population of Delhi would continue to live in Shahjahanabad, this was impractical for both governance and access. It could also not really be considered Delhi. The site west of the ridge at Malcha was compromised due to the lack of easy communication. The ridge itself obstructed views of the older Delhis of the past. That's a direct quotation. Not quite a tactically strong choice for the seat of government, and it too could hardly be considered Delhi. The Delhi Town Planning Committee that arrived in Delhi on April 15, 1912, explored Delhi during the sweltering months of April and May, agonized over this decision for the future imperial capital. And as the story goes, a frustrated Lord Hardinge, the Viceroy of India at the time, reflected in his book, The Indian Years, and I quote, I, then after rejecting the Malta site, mounted and asked Haley, later Lord Haley, the Commissioner of Delhi, to accompany me to choose a new site, and we galloped across the plain to a hill some distance away. From the top of the hill, there was a magnificent view embracing Old Delhi and all the principal monuments situated outside the town. The Jamuna winding its way like a silver streak in the foreground at a little distance. I said at once to Haley, this is the site for Government House, and he readily agreed. End quote. The committee made this decision and submitted its first report by mid-June. The hill that Hardinge described was Raisena Hill, and thus selecting the site that would eventually become Lutyens' Delhi. A decision made in a matter of 2 months among a wide-ranging selection of prospective cities does make for an interesting thought experiment. Just think about the possibilities, the alter egos, as it were, of Delhi if any of the other sites were selected. But I want to talk more about how this site was selected, looking at sort of environmental histories. In the words of environmental historian William Cronin, and I quote again, human acts occur within a network of relationships, processes, and systems that are as ecological as they are cultural. To such basic historical categories as gender, class, and race, environmental historians would add a theoretical vocabulary in which plants, animals, solids, climates, and other non-human entities become the co-actors and determinants of a history, not just of the people, but of the earth itself. And I could not agree more. A map from 1901 of the environs of Delhi, perhaps unbeknownst to the surveyors of the time, reveals the ground that would eventually become the site for New Delhi. Site selection was deeply impacted by the larger ecology and territory that would eventually produce the city we know today. With the seat of the Raj at Raisena Hill and the east-west access of Rajpath down to the Yamuna, this site provided not just an advantageous high ground, it was situated on a fertile alluvial floodplain, thus allowing exponential opportunities for the success of non-native plants and landscapes. And I'm sure Pradeep Krishan spoke about this in the selection of sort of non-native trees and the ubiquity of lawns, an English fantasy on sort of realized on an arid plain. Here, nestled between the ridge and the river, the British could envision a tabula rasa. But the development of New Delhi came an erasure of the landscape that created it, and that's what I want to explore further. Between the Aravali and the Yamuna, dozens of dynasties and empires have built successful cities. From the mythical city of Indraprasth to the prosperous city of the Mughal Empire at Shahjahanabad, to present-day New Delhi. Maps, sketches, wood carvings, and photographs from 19th and 20th century Delhi provide visual cues to the landscape ecology and geomorphology of Delhi. Investigating the history and the terraforming of the British capital at New Delhi in the early 20th century gives cues to the radical transformation of the landscape. This plan in particular that was published in the Britannica Encyclopedia sort of tends to give cues to how sort of that radical transformation of the landscape took place. So shown here in red over an existing, the imperial city shown here in red over an existing territory in black beckons the question, where is the ridge? What happens to the streams and gullies flowing to the river when they hit the imperial red line? Are there no existing settlements where the city of Delhi is planned? Dating back to 1901, a mere 20 years earlier, this map reveals more about the politics of the future than it does when it was drawn. The Aravali range and the Yamuna stand isolated in their detail, expressing sinuous patterns, the river drawn with a degree of fidelity to the sandbars and the braided networks. The Aravalis, though not detailed with contours, forms a continuous terrain of a fold mountain. And present in this map is the deeply intertwined relationship between the Aravali and the Yamuna watershed, with streams from the foothills of the mountains, from the foothills of the mountains. Despite the lack of topographical information on the plain between the ridge and the river, the stream illustrates the slope and drainage. As you can sort of see here, these streams that eventually drain towards the Yamuna. This sketch from the mid-19th century, published in a German newspaper, reinforces this more aqueous and topographically dynamic nature of Delhi. Gullies, nalas, and ravines occupy a complex terrain and vegetated fluvial landscape. The image also brings into focus the Aravali range that envelops the city in the background, and the Yamuna that flows directly east of Red Fort, a full river when this image was created with an expansive floodplain. Dating back even further, the sketch of the environs of Delhi map from 1807 scales up to further crystallize the importance of these two geological features within which Delhi sits. Note the extent of the ridge that encompasses Delhi and the city of Shahjahanabad, situated at the meeting point of the ridge and the river. The watershed of the Yamuna, the thickness of the streams, and the braiding of the river is even clearer here. Lakes appear on the landscape with well-defined areas, and the Najafgarh drain is called out as a drain, not as a drain, but as a jheel. So going back 200 years, this landscape is even clearer than it is 50 years from then. Guidebooks produced by the British Empire, these particular maps have been taken from a popular guidebook of the time, Murray's Handbook for Travelers by John Murray, mapped Delhi for nearly 100 years from the mid-1800s to the mid-1900s, bringing the environmental history of Delhi into focus. Going left to right from the formation of Lutyens and Bakers Delhi, it is important to note how the Aravali Mountains are fragmented and renamed the hills, parentheses, Southern Ridge. In the middle image, you see even in 1911, before the conception of New Delhi, the Aravali Mountains are named the Aravali Mountains. and appear as a continuous range and geological feature. Which begs the obvious question, is a mountain less of a mountain if it's called a ridge? And why is it now called a hill and not a mountain? On the far right map from 1901, the river and ridge are rendered prominently, along with the ravines and the smaller hills within Delhi, giving prominence to the terrain and geomorphology of the city. Between 1901 and 1924, in a mere 23 years, the landscape of Delhi appears to have been flattened. In this act of flattening, representation produces doctrine, a signifier that these landscapes and commons are not defined by their inherent geology or geomorphology, and are possibly expendable non-human entities and not quite part of the vision of modern Delhi. But just like the urban fabric has form, as you can see within both the Lutyens Delhi, Shahjahanabad, situated in this landscape, rivers and mountains have form too that is produced through a dynamic evolution of natural systems through time. The Aravalis and the Yamuna have their own histories and architectures that are understood at larger spatial and temporal scales. The site analysis is an important aspect of what we do as architects and planners and landscape architects. We seldom critically interrogate these ecologies and landscapes when investigating a site. The Aravalis are a 700-kilometer long range running northeast to southwest in a series of overlapping fold mountains that start at Delhi and terminate in Gujarat. The range is considered as one of the oldest in the world, predating the Himalayas by more than 2 billion years. It is, and that was billion with a B. It is the singular geological feature that contains the spread of the desert from west to east. It is no accident that the Aravalis are the divide between the fertile Indo-Gangetic plain and the desert. The Aravalis' role, in addition to the topography expressed on the surface, is perhaps better understood in the small section that shows the geological breaks that the mountain range provides. Sectionally, in this section you can see, it's a sectional sort of thickening section of the earth. The bedrock contains the rich alluvial sands of the floodplain to the right, where the old cities of New Delhi are settled. So this in brown is the bedrock, and you can see this is the sand layer. So it sort of contains the sand layer from drifting or moving. That's the alluvial floodplain. And it prevents, it disconnects that from the clay and sort of conker layer and soils to the west. And really, as environmental historians or landscape architects or soil scientists or even gardeners will tell you, soil is the base and medium on which civilizations rise and fall. This deeply fundamental geology has really produced Delhi. If you look at the surface, quarrying operations have reduced the Aravali belt to a collection of small and isolated hillocks. In Delhi, the northern and southern ridge have been reduced to miniaturized version of the hills seen previously in the wood carvings from the 1800s and to spatial configurations beyond recognition. This map of Lutyens' master plan outlines the old and new quarries in the Aravali that produced Lutyens' vision. It is important to realize the shared material and ecological history that produced New Delhi and the countless cities before. They are born from the ridge. You can see old quarries here, new quarries here. This is quarries over here, which is all part of the ridge. The scale of terraforming from the foundation stone of the imperial city to the present-day mining operations along the entire length of the Aravalis has altered the range to such an extent that it has given the desert the gaps it needs. 12 gaps to be exact, 12 gaps to be exact for the desert to claim new terrain. And the sands have begun to drift east. You can see there are a lot more gaps up here, closer to Jaipur and Delhi along Alwar, along that belt. And there's one here. So here's my proposition. Perhaps it's better to imagine a future Delhi that is more desert than we know today, more in line with this image of a transformed dune landscape, understood only if architects, planners, and landscape architects explore the geological impacts to the landscape and imagine spatially the impacts on territory in ecological and geological time. We are indeed in the Anthropocene. And I use the word Anthropocene here as a sort of a catch-all for significant human impact to sort of global ecosystems and geology, very sort of simplified meaning. And of course, there are sort of competing ideas about Capitalocene and Plantationocene that should be looked at as well. But here I just want to make the point that when we look at it in the context of a larger geological scale, this image does not seem untenable. Similarly, a river is a complex system with a dynamic form and flow. Its geomorphology is the result of a continuous hydrogeomorphic process. That is to say, a river channel is constantly evolving, especially one like the Yamuna, a meandering, sinuous, rain and glacier-fed river that has a tendency to forge new channels and paths with changes in water velocity due to annual and seasonal changes in precipitation. Something like the monsoon is a huge change every year. And when I say changes, I mean dramatic territorial shifts. And I'll talk about that more in a minute. But throughout its 1,400 kilometers, the Yamuna adapts and evolves to create a complex system of meandering and braided channels. Meandering and braided channels are very common, but a highly specific type of river morphology. The Yamuna's geomorphology, like most rivers, is defined by variability in sinuosity, slope, channel width, bar area, valley characteristics, flow rate, sort of sediment and silt load, stream power, riverine habitat, to name a few components that come together to create this watery assemblage. As spatial thinkers operating in the Anthropocene, it is important to understand that the geomorphology of a river like the Yamuna, and by extension of the Ganga and all its tributaries, is far from ever being stable. Moreover, as we all probably know, the Yamuna, when it is the portion, the beaches that are in Delhi, are considered more or less dead. Apart from the pollutants leaching into the river, sand mining and water extraction that certainly impact the river, but it's not pollution that I want to focus on. It is the inability of the river to flow at adequate capacity to transfer silt and sediment that provides nutrition to the riparian habitat or gather enough water velocity, which is basically what stream power is likely an equal culprit in the river's demise. It is severely limited. It is severely limited to and due to anthropogenic forces, and you can kind of get a sense of that from the study, where this is where it meets Delhi, and you can see a massive reduction in sediment transfer and sand loads and stream power, compared to what you can see upstream and what you can see further downstream. Studies, scores of studies are done like this to understand this. And this particular one here shows that despite all odds, it is not just the pollutants that are causing the Yamuna to quote unquote be dead. It has to do with more of the geomorphology of the river itself and what we're sort of allowing it to behave like. Moreover, meandering rivers tend to migrate. They continuously erode the bank on the far side of a meander, depositing sediment on the closer side here and eroding the backside, where water tends to slow down and drop particles. A meandering river migrates in the direction of the eroding bank. With drastic changes in climate, including increase in rainfall, depletion of vegetated banks, and flash floods upstream, it's not just a question of when and how the river will flood cities and other urban centers, which is, of course, a completely legitimate problem, but that already exists that needs to be reframed and addressed by planners, architects, landscape architects, and engineers. But consideration and sort of projecting the change of a river's course at a regional, if not planetary scale due to these high energy events is critical. These large-scale climatic and therefore geomorphological shifts will in turn impact the more local scale. With increased flood events, and given what we know about meandering rivers, their sort of tendency to migrate towards the eroding bank, is the future course of the Yamuna in this dashed line really impossible to imagine? And this is Lutyens Delhi, this is Rajpath, you can see here. Looking at images from the 18th century that we looked at a while ago, the Yamuna already appears to have forged new channels due to anthropogenic forces, but partly within its own floodplain. From once flowing close to the walls of Shahjahanabad, in 200 years, the river has changed dramatically. Imagining unforeseen futures at timescales that are ecological is critical. And relegating the effects of climate change to coastal towns and cities is short-sighted. The Delhi master plan being drafted for 2041 is still structured and centered around trite narratives of smart city and global city with technological solutions, but really little consideration on the effects of climate change on Delhi. And if you don't think this is possible, looking at geological timescales, would you believe that Yamuna did not always flow through Delhi? Originating in the Shivaliks, recent geophysical and hydroclimatic research indicates that the Yamuna was likely to have been a tributary of the Ghaggar-Saraswati Indus watershed instead of the Indo-Gangetic watershed. Its former course, identified by soil deposits, points to this hypothesis, as does myth and Vedic scripture, where the river Saraswati that would have flowed through present-day Dholavira, Lothal, and Umarkot, which is now in present-day Pakistan, and has been speculated to support the Harappan civilization, was once the drainage channel of the Yamuna. In the map here, you can see in the dashed lines the changes in the course of the Yamuna at a planetary scale. It is speculated that climate change, most likely the change in monsoon about 6,000 to 4,000 years ago, may have brought upon this change. Looking at ecological timescales, the river has moved and evolved in the past 20 years, changing course and creating new sediment regimes, even with the minimal flow of the river as it passes Delhi's multiple dams and excessive aquifer extraction that keeps the flow rate drastically reduced. So even though it doesn't really have the power, it doesn't have its full capacity, it still changes over time. You can see this is from 2000 and this is present day. Looking more closely at the site under investigation, which is the Central Vista project, in its current spatial configuration, one of the river's eroding edge flows towards Rajpath. So the sinuosity of the river, it turns this way, and Rajpath is here, as you would have seen in the previous slide. So here's my second proposition. Is it impossible to imagine Purana Killa and India Gate may one day be in the Yamuna? When you look at the recent flooding and storm events in Delhi, along with the history of the river from 200 and also 4,000 years ago, this image, again, does not seem untenable. As Dipesh Chakrabarti states, and I quote, "The discussion about the crisis of climate change can thus produce affects and knowledge about collective human pasts and futures that work at the limits of historical understanding." So the point being that to sort of imagine futures and think about what will happen in the future requires a deep understanding of the history of a space over long periods of time. And slipped into this image is also, not to forget, the air quality crisis that Delhi is experiencing and most of North India is experiencing. That significantly impacts ecology. Is not something that's talked about significantly impacting ecology, but it is sort of a primary factor in how a biome or an ecology performs. And just as an aside, I want to mention that you know, when you do climate study and sort of climate archaeology in a way, you really dig up ice core samples, and it's sort of an interesting geology of the air. So when you think about climate, sort of the register of climate change is really air. It's an interesting way to start thinking about how you project futures. I mean, this is our current reality right now. Um, and what is our geological footprint going to be in those ice core samples that gather aerosols such as dust, ash, pollen, sea salts, among other things in the atmosphere at the time, and really kind of fossilize them in the ice core. So it's an interesting record of the air, and primary sort of data archaeology of like climate change. But sort of bringing back this most unarchitectural of graphics, it is not far-fetched to speculate that the confluence of the Yamuna and the Aravali has been the key catalyst for the success of all past cities of Delhi. And despite all odds, maybe the future too. The geological disposition of the ridge to the west and the river to the east gives Delhi its environmental and hydroclimatic conditions. So ridge to the west and river to the east gives Delhi its hydroclimatic conditions for the city to thrive. The rich alluvial soils and the foreboding scrubby hills that limit the expansion of the desert provides Delhi a spatial sweet spot to sculpt its urban form, its landscape, and a microclimate for its rich ecology that betrays the arid plain on which the city sits. Surely Lord Hardinge did not know any of this when he made a snap judgment to decide to settle New Delhi on Raisina Hill and going down towards the river. So today I leave you with this. In considering development in Delhi and the proposed rehauling of Lutyens Delhi, it is prudent to reconsider the timescales and territorial scales planners, architects, and landscape architects need to consider, especially in the Anthropocene. These are the commons, these non-human entities, the ridge, the river, the soils, the climate. These are the commons that we need to think about. Being agile is key. Deliberating the non-human entities that are the co-determinants of an ecology and a landscape in which humans, and I quote Dipesh again, wield a geological force is critical. These expanded scales, both the investigation of the past and an active imagining of the future at local and planetary scales, need to inform the city of the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Khyati. That was really, really wonderful, and I really enjoyed the framing of the conversation around questions that are really geological in and also geological in time. Thank you so much. I'm going to request those who are participating to please type in your questions. I apologize for not saying that, but that, as you know, is the norm. And we will unmute you, and perhaps you can turn your videos on and ask questions. And of course, I very much invite our panelists to join us and participate. So thank you again, Khyati. That was really, really incredible. So maybe I could start with a question slash. So I love the two provocations, but I find them that it's kind of interesting. One is desert, and the other is a waterscape, and they're two completely divergent. In a sense, they're completely divergent provocations, and it strikes me that going back to this notion that the Anthropocene is also a geological force, right? That we act at now at a geological scale. That whether both these provocations are entirely kind of anthropological, like they are totally within our somehow ambit of things to plan around or to consider as we produce the next 100, 200 years of the urbanization and framing of the city. And then related to that is also this flattening. I really loved very much these three maps that you had of Murray's handbook from 1901 to 1924. And I love just the act of representation, right? The drawing of these maps and subtle changes in the drawing by just like not drawing the mountain range, or not even subtle changes, just nomenclature changes, calling it moving from mountain to hill. I thought that was fascinating, that just in a period of 20 years, you flatten, sort of ontologically flatten the landscape. And I think that is almost essential to everything that follows, right? Like you have to somehow construct the terrain or deconstruct the terrain in order to be able to hegemonize it in a certain way. And maybe these processes are not as linear, but I think that really for me was completely eye-opening, really fascinating. So then the second question would be, what forms of representation or what imaginaries should we create in order to consider these lenses that you provoke, or to even begin to frame the question is I think framing of a certain kind of way of looking, which of course happens through representation and other means.
Yeah, Sarush, thanks for those questions. Yeah, I was equally fascinated when I discovered that, and honestly, in putting this together, I think I have more questions than I have answers at this point. I think the idea of flattening is so interesting, and the change in nomenclature is so interesting, and which is why I find also that really simple, like the geological section of the mountain with the river on one side and the sort of desert soils on one side, like so powerful, even though it's so feels like a really dumbed down version of the thing that it is. That it kind of represents this very, it kind of represents, I think when we're thinking about the Anthropocene, we also need to think about in sort of sectional terms, right? Both in terms of like the air above, but also the sort of not just groundwater and aquifer and sort of all of those systems, but also what's happening to the soil below, the bedrock, where the salinity, and I'm talking about like deep into the earth, and how that all sort of comes together. So I think representation is an interesting, especially as designers, representation is an interesting way to start to approach these things. It's like just by drawing something, you kind of make it real, just by the act of representing something. And I'm sure in the past presentations from this week, you must have seen this as well, where like representation takes on different forms, and trying to show that the breadth of how to represent something is an important part of creating that sort of legacy and that doctrine in a way. And how you occupy it, how you represent territory is like how you occupy it, basically. And so I think that when you think about how to frame the question, to me, it's really like, what is it that you want to like explore in terms of scalar limits, and just starting to think about like scaling up and scaling down. And I think having sort of that agility is really important, because those concepts sort of transfer over. What happens at the local scale is also critical to understand, like what like is scalable at a regional scale or like a planetary scale as well to some extent. And then you start thinking about air, and you just start thinking about the ground below, and that sectional where opening up that scale of the section also creates new frameworks to look at. And so I would honestly just think about like reframing, even just representationally reframing issues by looking at sort of the deep sections, and the deep the stratosphere as like a way to start engaging with these issues. And the flattening, I think that's an interesting thing as well when it comes to maps and like looking at old maps, because they all tend to flatten the terrain that they're representing. And then, of course, there's the perennial problem of not being able to represent water, whether that's shorelines or it's a floodplain or a river channel or a stream, because these are extremely perennial, like non-perennial things, especially in this part of the world where the monsoon kind of swells and swells and contracts these waterways. So I think starting to represent those in interesting ways as well, or expanding how we start to represent them, maybe not with lines, maybe with something else, is a next step in both reframing and also not flattening the terrain. Did I answer your question to some extent?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I do like very much the idea of the section, and sort of considering the section as also a sort of geological, geomorphic construct in the location of the city. And in that section that you show, which is so technocratic, you kind of see the Yamuna as literally a little, just a little like dent in the surface, which is really quite terrific. It goes back to something that I don't know if Professor Chai is listening, but it's something that he also observed in the previous lectures, that sort of sectional thinking has actually been a theme in all of the lectures thus far that have talked about landscape, which is sort of fascinating. So again, I open it up to questions.
Khyati, if I may actually add a little bit to the same direction that Sarosh raised the issue. I mean, with the section, and also, I mean, considering that you are practicing in the field of landscape, I was wondering whether there's a new kind of vocabulary that comes up when one thinks, I mean, those three maps were wonderful, because you could sense that the vocabulary, the words that were being used to describe the landscape was changing. And I was wondering if you have some thoughts on a vocabulary that perhaps needs to take and register both the sectional thinking, but also this kind of larger scale of time where Delhi has seems to have an imminent desert approaching. So I'm just saying that those, I wonder whether as a practitioner, that's a question for you.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think in terms of, so as a practitioner, I would say the thing that landscape architects like to really focus on more than anything that you see on the ground is really the soil. And that's sort of a critical thing, and the depth of the soil and the profile of the soil and what is below the soil. And, you know, that's sort of, and of course, this is a section I'm talking maybe like 3 meters down, not really talking about like 100 meters down or 200 meters down into the ground. But I think starting to think about what is below will and should really inform what happens above in a way. And so your question about sort of a new vocabulary is an interesting one. And I think I want to say that I think to some extent architects are a little bit behind when we think about this, because of course all of like the sort of geophysical, geomorphic sort of sciences that look at these scales and look at these concepts already start to talk about that sort of sectional relationship and having that vocabulary about how you how do you archive or how do you create an archaeology of what's below in a way. So it's an interesting question. I'm not quite sure of like what the new vocabulary is necessarily, but I think as a practicing landscape architect, I would definitely say it starts with the soil and it starts with what's happening below. And that's sort of the first thing, whether it's talking about, whether it's talking about sort of the ecology of the soil itself, and you're talking about like the nematodes and sort of the creatures and the critters that are in the soil, from like very simple ecological building of the soil in a way, to and thinking about all of those sort of components to it, and to, of course, like scaling that up and thinking about regional scale soils and the section of that, and how the bedrock intersects with the and what the bedrock might be made of, minerals, and all of those sort of things. So starting to think about things leaching into the soil. It's not a pancake that's like flat and nothing sort of happens in it. There's like so much happening in it. All of like there's more life in there than we think about. So
No, I think it's interesting what you're suggesting, because I mean, in the 70s, 80s, 90s, we borrowed as architects and spatial planners, as we are clubbed together with others. We borrowed from, from literature, from philosophy, from various disciplines. And I think what you're pointing at is the disciplines that one will have to engage with to develop a language, perhaps to understand and to engage with the dimensions that you're talking about. So I think that's the direction that you're suggesting, I imagine.
Yeah. My comment or question is a little, I was imagining myself to be a kind of tribal elder who came to this place, and he was told that either it will become the river or it will become the desert. And then together with my colleagues, I had to decide what to do with that land. And the traditional way of doing it might have been to create a special kind of place, which is, for example, in Gujarat, wherever the water collects, it's termed Gochar land, and the Acacia nilotica is planted because it can survive in water or it can survive in dry conditions, either ways. And nothing is done there, except your cows can go and graze there. And you can play cricket if you like, but not much more. So one way of looking at it is to say, would it be fascinating if Delhi became, let's say, Mohenjo-daro or Harappa or Dholavira? Would it be fascinating if we suddenly had a biome at the center of our national imagination, rather than people or rather than buildings? And I'm thinking of the degree to which one can stretch this. Because your presentation works for millions or thousands or at least hundreds of years. And if we stretch that imagination, then wisdom is something else. I know the science of it, and you can tell us, and all that is fine. But as a designer, one has to wisely move into the territory between India Gate and the Yamuna. This is our territory, our site. And the questions or the stimulus that you give, what would you do if you were completely free, no land value problems, nothing? What would you do with this piece of land, or this wonderful place which is likely to change in the next 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, 100 years, 200 years, into a river or into a desert? What would you do?
That's a great question. So I'll start from your earlier points where I think sort of the idea of the biome or designing for a biome is a really interesting thing that that needs to be perhaps further incorporated in the way we even think about. I'm going to give the architect and planner way of thinking about this, is that maybe we need to have sort of biome-centric agencies. I don't know. Or like definitely watershed-centric agencies, right? So like the entire Indo-Gangetic Plain should have a watershed sort of body that like proposes policy or proposes the care of biomes or proposes habitat and sort of investigates these questions in a more thoughtful and deeper way. And that is the thing that really informs, it should inform any kind of like future city or any kind of settlement, any kind of sort of infrastructural development that we're talking about. Because when you look at the map and you see all the rivers that go through that area, it's a really rich biome that needs to be thought of as a holistic, as a bigger system, as part of a bigger sort of composition on the sort of plains and south of the Himalayas and the plains and how it kind of envelops it. So I think that should probably be true for also the Indus rivers and all the rivers in the south and the Deccan Plateau. So you can start to like think about it from that perspective of how you construct a future through sort of planning and architecture and landscape architecture, thinking through policy and agencies and like a larger scope of work or having a higher sort of organizing body that looks at all of this stuff. And your previous comment about in Gujarat, when there's water in a place and you plant acacia and it's sort of grazing land, I think is like sort of this sort of ephemerality that produces landscapes is really important. But I think it's also good to remember that they are in fact ephemeral. So they should take place as they do and then disappear, and they will. And they will do that. So
let me reframe the question a little more. I like to probe this a little bit. Children all over the country, they look at the Republic Day parade and they feel very good.
They still?
I think so. No, there may be problems, but there's still a great, you see, you are not talking about who is ruling.
Mm-hmm.
You're talking about
Understood.
something bigger than that, maybe the Constitution. But whatever it is, there is an ownership of a certain kind. Yeah. Can there be another kind of ownership in nature, for example? And what would how would that happen is, to me, the question before alter ego.
I mean, I think it's hard to think about ownership in nature when you're thinking about, if we're talking about the Anthropocene. So I think the predominant.
I think ownership is the wrong word. Let us say deep reverence is another way of putting it, or saying I'm part of this. I'm part of this. So all the big words are problems. I would like to simplify my language completely and say, I'm part of this, or something of me feels great about that. I think because, looking at the institutional formats for, the Indus and the Ganges and the Yamuna and all that is going to be something that's done at another level. Mm-hmm. The architect can do very little about.
Well, I mean, I think I will definitely address the thing, but I think what I'm also proposing is that architects should engage at that higher level. If I don't know how to think about the agency of, and I think what you're maybe talking about is the agency of like non-human things, right? And what I was proposing is whether that may be very well the ridge and the river, that those are sort of the agents that will impact Delhi, or thinking about the site in that very sort of site-specific way, are the components that will perhaps in sort of the longue durée be the primary drivers, hopefully much less than humans. And so I don't quite have an answer in terms of like thinking of like the non-human sort of what it's going to be necessarily, but maybe I can respond to the previous provocation, which was like, what would I do on the site?
Yes.
I don't think it's sort of like a giving. I don't think the approach is just thinking about. Honestly, when I'm thinking about this, I think like everything that is sort of systemically connected. So I think you can do one thing, even if I was, say, for example, to bring the river into the site, or create sort of sort of a massive detention basin that would allow for the river to flood and allow for a new sort of habitat that could be cultivated. And would allow sort of public space, and we talk about the commons and the public space, and like really connect this idea. And what's interesting, in some of the older maps as well, they actually show a lake at the end of India Gate instead of actually having the stadium, all the other things that we have there now. And so like, I think all of those things are actually like realizable now if we wanted to do it. It's not something that's so far-fetched in a way. So I think all of those things would be really good use of expanding the commons and expanding the public space. In fact, it would in fact be more powerful than having sort of a massive stadium at the end of that whole thing. That just honestly feels like I've lived and grown up in Delhi basically my entire life, and I don't really feel like I have a relationship with the river. The only time I would see it was when I would go across maybe to like Noida, and you would go across Kalandi Kunj Bridge and you would see the river a little bit for a very short period of time, but I don't personally feel like I have a relationship with the river. So there's sort of perhaps even a cultivating of that at a more human scale, at a sort of more sensorial scale, is like, how do you engage the public with the river? And that may eventually inform for whatever reason, policy, or inform attitude, or inform experiences to the larger public. But in saying that, I will also say that I think the system and the scale of this thing is much larger. And what, yeah, so I mean, I think that is obvious.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's great.
Shilpa, did you have a question?
Yeah. Hi, Khyati. Yeah, so thank you for that like lovely clear presentation and kind of getting the scale, like enlarging the scale of how we kind of look at history, you know. So I had a very, and all, I mean, the discussion was, these big questions were very important, and I want to bring it down to a very mundane question which I have, which is, and probably because you're a landscape architect and you're looking at this in the geological time, you can help me. So I was just looking, you know, there's this observation that, and probably there is an obvious answer to this, but that most, like, because you showed this diagram of the meander of the river, right? And this whole idea that the outer bank is the one which gets eroded and the inner bank, which is where the deposition happens. And it's a pretty kind of known thing. And but when you look at cities, like most cities, you look at Banaras, Mathura, come down to Ahmedabad, Nashik, you look at Delhi also, I was just looking at it. Most of them happen on the outer banks of the river where the erosion happens. So what is that, like, why does that happen? It's a very, I don't know, very mundane this thing, but what is the reason why most settlements kind of begin on that outer edge where it's a sharper edge, you know, rather than the softer edge, like the...
Honestly, that's a great question. But if you look back, so Delhi, for example, specifically Delhi, just talking about that, Shahjahanabad was actually settled on the side of the river that was the inner bank of the time. So it's interesting where like old cities were actually settled on the inner banks, probably because they had a sense of like, oh, that, you know, when the flood happens, like that is going to erode. Experience, or, you know, just sort of simple observation. Because at that time, probably the landscape was easier to compute because you could like physically see it, which you can't really anymore. You don't really know what the Yamuna looks like. You know, if you go to Delhi, you don't exactly like get the meander anymore, right? Because there's a lot of things happening. But I think it's interesting, and I'm sure, I think I don't know if there is a relationship in particular. It's an interesting question, and I think it would be fun to go look at all of these things and see how old city versus sort of the new cities have been settled. And the other interesting component of this always is like the railway lines, because when that infrastructure went in, it kind of informed where the settlement would happen, the future settlement. And that had to do with like very mundane sort of logistical infrastructural planning of like what made more sense and where the railway should come. So it's interesting, but I think like in Delhi, for example, all of the cities were in Shahjahanabad, but like Firoz Shah city or like any of the Delhi Sultanate cities were all within the floodplain between the ridge and the river. And there aren't like that many cities further beyond. And my guess is that it probably had to do with sort of the larger scale geomorphology that tended to probably erode the other side. But I think it's a good question. I don't know the answer to it.
Confused, like, because actually even in Banaras, it happens on the outer edge of the city. Because if you see the opposite banks where it is, which is the inner, like the inner bank, and that's left as actually a floodplain. And it's because one would imagine it's the other way around. Like you would not build on the floodplain. I mean, you would build not on the eroded edge. So I was just wondering, it's like the traditional cities, yeah.
But I've always thought that this is because of defense. When your foot soldiers or horsemen are coming, it's good to have the fort and the palace on a high cliff rather than stepping into the river. And it's in most cities that I have observed, I have found that it is a defense purpose which leads to this choice. Costs a lot to make the retaining walls and all that, but it's worth the cost given that you will be attacked at any time. Sorry to come in like that.
Professor Vasavda, did you have a question?
Yeah.
Well, a little bit to the question of Shilpa. For example, if you see Ahmedabad, it's very interesting. You see where the river turns, it is actually the area where water recedes away on the other bank. And then when the city limits start, the water once again comes back to the city side. But the difference is that the land is higher where the city is established. And that is the advantage, you see. And when the water comes nearer to the city, I think it also feeds the city very well. Because if you see the original water wheel and other things, they were actually located near the port. And that's why, it was really kind of meandering. And then they selected that site, you see, where the water was available in a longer period of time, because Ahmedabad river was not perennial. So this also could be the consideration. Perhaps that can answer Shilpa's question.
I had a small question. You showed these sites where the British were considering building the capital. And there was one very interesting site which I had no idea about, across on the east banks of the river towards UP. And I was just wondering if you found any evidence in your research to why they would have rejected any of the other locations. I know they probably picked Raisina Hills because of its sort of the height and the kind of location that it had. But was there a specific reason given for the rejection of the other ones? Perhaps the changing course of the river or anything like that?
So the one closer to sort of north of Shahjahanabad, the Darbar site was, and if you look at a map, it makes it really obvious. It's like the ridge comes this way and then the river comes this way. So the floodplain is very close to, the ridge. And so they had major sort of flooding issues there then as well, sort of the records say. And the water table was really high. So every time the river would swell, sort of the water would even come out of the ground. And so that was a consideration at that time. For the other side of the bank, I think it was mostly, I didn't read anything about sort of the changing course of the river, but I think the fact that the river does make it expands significantly when the monsoon hits, makes it very difficult to sort of make it navigable waterway from east to west. So I think if they would have wanted to think about that, it would have been sort of a harder infrastructure that would have to go over the river at that time. And I think maybe it was just like, maybe they didn't want, to do that or engage in sort of that infrastructural planning. And I think at that time they were also, there was a lot of canal building and a lot of water infrastructure that was taking place. And it was a lot about sort of making sort of the arid landscape more productive. And so I think maybe that wasn't necessarily. I think it could also be an interesting history where to see like how agriculture was taking place, because I'm quite sure there was agriculture taking place on the other side of the bank. And so that could have been an interesting relationship as well. I don't quite have any evidence of it, but I suspect that that's probably true. And then the third one, across over to the ridge, I think is particularly interesting because you know, one is that they hadn't at that point quarried the ridge, so that it was actually, and as the maps also suggest, it was called a mountain and not really a hill, and it wasn't really called a ridge at all. So they hadn't quite quarried it to the extent that they did eventually for producing all of the buildings that eventually came out of, you know, that are part of Lutyens Delhi. And I think the idea was that it was just too far for any sort of direct communication with Shahjahanabad. And I think it was also very, just you know, the vantage point that they got from Raisina Hill of being able to oversee all the other cities. I think the mutiny of 1857 was still fresh in everyone's mind. So, you know, having sort of this overarching position of like power, both significant, like topographically, but also you know, in terms of governance, was an important aspect of it. And I think what's interesting is that both the cantonments, the one during 1857 was on the other side of the ridge, and the new cantonment was also eventually behind Raisina Hill, was on the other side of the ridge. And so there's an interesting thing over there where it's like they wanted the seat of power to actually be on the quote unquote right side of the ridge, but the, you know, hidden away behind is like the army that is actually the you know, the reserves to make sure that like no one is messing around. So it's like, it's an interesting way that they kind of chose the territory that they did. But in also looking at some of those geological sections, I think it's also an interesting thing to consider that maybe on the other side of the ridge, they may not have thought about this, but they wouldn't have possibly been able to achieve the lush Lutyens Delhi that, you know, we see today, because it has a completely different soil profile. It has a very different composition. It has very, not significantly different climatic conditions, but it definitely does experience more of, you know, the loop and all of that. And the ridge is kind of a buffer, is meant to be a buffer. So yeah, they're all interesting speculations. Maybe no lawns and no sort of lush landscape on the other side of the ridge.
I have a small question. I found your quarry, the map with quarries, quite interesting. And some were really situated close to the city. It looked like somewhere on the ridge. So what has happened of these quarries when the city took over? What kind of landscape and habitat are they now?
Most of them are actually part of the ridge. So if you go to the ridge, you will see like the rock cut faces and all of that. It's right there, and you can tell in most locations that, you know, these are rock cut faces. These are not natural formations or not natural cuts. And so that area has been sort of deeply quarried, but it's also restricted. And that's the other interesting thing, is that, so the northern ridge you can still access. It's close to Delhi University, the North Campus and other things, and you can still access it. There are small portions of the southern ridge that you can access, but you can't actually access all of the southern ridge. So there's an overgrowth of a tree called kikar, which is an exotic tree, which is a foreign tree, let me say non-native tree, that has taken over, especially the ridge. And so there's also this, you know, interesting conversation between like, how do you make the ridge a public space? Because currently it isn't really. It is part of the commons, and like the northern ridge more so, but the southern ridge is sort of more isolated, and like there are boundary walls and you can't really go into it. There are some areas that you can see, but generally all of those quarried spaces, they've kind of been left to their own devices. They're part of the sort of, you know, gambit of like the southern ridge, and they're
all situated in the ridge. There's nothing in the city or closer to the city, because the map suggested there were some on the ridge, but there was some sort of more central to the city. That didn't happen.
I'm sure those are, I'm sure I think most of them were on the ridge because that's where the sort of the Delhi quartzite was, basically was. And so if that was cut down, it was probably, it's a good question. I think most of them were in the ridge and the formation of the fold mountains, because that's where the quartzite was. And the rest of it was mostly the alluvial floodplain.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Khyati. This has been really, really illuminating. And again, thank you for doing this and for putting together this very, I love the scope of the thing historically and geographically. So thank you again.
Thank you for having me. It was, honestly, it was very interesting for me to put this together as well. And I think your questions are really provocative and really great for thinking about like this further. And I'm very curious about now I'm going to go look at all the meandering rivers and like see where all the cities are located. And it's like an interesting project. And I think it's an interesting thing to think about the scalar, think about this in a scalar way. But thank you for having me. It was really a pleasure to speak with you all. And yeah, I'm glad I hope.
Khyati,
and I'm
did
glad
you
I was
put
able
this?
to contribute.
Did you put this together for this talk, this presentation?
Yes.
Thank you very much. That was wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for doing that.
Of course.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you all.